Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Story 1. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise. Took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had the life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it.
Story 2. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test.
Story 3. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist." Poor Aunt Gloria just wants to be a nudie lady and everyone acts like she's a leper.
Story 4. My aunt was a real piece of work. To backtrack a moment, this side of my family isn't biological. Technically my dad is my stepdad, but he raised me from toddlerhood and he's my dad, pure and simple. All of his family treated me as one of their own. Except my aunt. She would always tell my grandparents that she just couldn't understand how they could love me, because I wasn't blood family. I have no idea why she didn't want her son back. It was a familial kidnapping, non-custodial father. When my cousin was returned, she ditched him with my grandparents and got back together with her other half. When I was a teenager, my grandma called my dad, crying. My aunt was doing some digging and discovered she and my dad were adopted. I'm not defending this, but it was the 1950s and in another country. Not disclosing an adoption wasn't unusual at the time. My aunt threatened to tell my dad, so my grandma called and said they were adopted. My dad's reaction was literally, "So?" My aunt never spoke to my grandparents again, and my cousin turned out exactly like her. And so, all those years of not liking me because I'm not blood backfired, because she isn't blood either. I'm glad that has never mattered to me.
Story 5. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child.
Story 6. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother.
Story 7. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned, where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Story 8. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty f***ed to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck. Never thinking something like that would get him killed.
Story 9. My grandfather had severely scarred legs from burns he got as a kid. Growing up, we were told that he was in a fire in an apartment building and sustained the burns while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great-aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. Great-grandfather was an abusive alcoholic piece of shit who f***ing maimed his son.
Story 10. Why the neighbors moved, trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them, their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill, the cops came to tell the family, and they left him urgently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered what ever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home, they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and essayed, then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home, they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep, the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them, as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one.
Story 11. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully, my mom has long since divorced my dad, and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents, who lived close by at the time, circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3 to 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom, a couple years ago, watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding.
Story 12. My older sister is not my full sister, she's my half-sister via my mother. My mother was married before and had my sister with her first husband. Her first husband assaulted my sister from when she was 2 or 3 years old. My mother caught him assaulting my sister, but no one believed her, and my sister was, from what I was told, f***ed up. My mother divorced him and he tried to get custody of my sister, so she ran away with my sister, even cutting contact with her own family to keep my sister safe. A few years later she met my dad, who unofficially adopted my sister, and they had me. I grew up not knowing, because my sister thought I might not love her the same if I knew we had different dads, and I think maybe some part of her wanted to forget her stepdad isn't really her biological dad. The only reason I ever found out when I was 20 is because somehow, my sister's biological grandmother found my mother's address and called. I answered the phone and she mistook me for my sister. That was an interesting phone call and afternoon.
Story 13. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter the mother had a mental breakdown not longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL.
Story 14. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there, and for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project.
Story 15. From when I was aged 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us, but he also had a drinking and driving problem, and after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement, as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him, but as it turns out that was only part of it. The other being that he had a massive grow-op for weed in the basement. Mom stated had the police found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but he would have had a giggle that weed is legal here now.
Story 16. This happened, and he was arrested before I was born. For some absolutely insane, unknown reason to me, he was released from prison when I was 9 and my parents allowed him and his girlfriend to stay with us for 2 weeks while waiting to get the keys to their new place. I was always told he's been in prison for drugs. For the record, my parents believed he was guilty. It wasn't anything like that. Why they would take the risk with a daughter in the home was beyond me. He was allowed at family functions despite constantly getting back into drugs, at one point narrowly avoiding having my grandma's car taken. One cousin had nothing to do with him. The other came to family functions for a while, but it was too painful for her, and she cut him off. I found out when my brother let it slip when I was 13. My parents weren't happy. I was horrified they ever let him around us. I told my brother from a young age, if he ever did anything like that, he was to me.
Story 17. When my father's dad died, the secret was out. Grandpa was an evil man who bootlegged liquor, stole cattle, and kidnapped Indian children to sell into slavery. He had a very public mistress, and coming home from a bender he knocked up his wife, my grandma. In order to save face to his mistress, he took the knitting needles to grandma, thus infecting her to die of sepsis in Territorial, New Mexico in 1929. My dad was 6 with younger brother 4, left to grow up as virtual orphans. Despised by the aunts and forbidden help from their uncles, my dad and his brother grew up in the Depression, almost starving, while their dad lived it up, traveling and committing many crimes that were easy to get away with because it was the Great Depression.
Story 18. My father is from small working town in eastern Ukraine. And most of our lives we've been poor. But my mother always praised my father for his ability to know the perfume by smell, and not only that but also he can recognize many famous perfumes by smelling them. Once, when I was 20-something years, I asked, why is that so? Where he obtained this skill. My father asked me to not ever tell this story to my mother. And here's the story. My father had a close friend who was actually a secret lover of one of the most famous Soviet singers, who officially had wife. But in reality he was gay and did a lot for gay community in Soviet Union. He brought a lot of expensive things from abroad, like new music, clothes, and perfumes. And a lot of that perfumes has been met at secret parties. This gay friend of my father also gave him all the fresh music releases vinyl, and he sold it and they shared the profit, unofficially of course. That's why my dad knows release years of most hits from 60s and 70s. And more of that, he told me about Special Square in Sochi, the place of Olympic Games 2014, where gays of USSR met each other and what secret signals they had.
Story 19. Husband's family has a dark secret that still isn't out to the people who really need to know, and I hate that I know. His youngest aunt was sent away when she was a teenager, and shortly after she returned, the oldest uncle and his wife introduced the family to their daughter. Young aunt went on to have 3 more kids who have no clue that their cousin is actually their half-sister. What's even more FD up is that her brothers know the secret. I'm dreadful that someone will need a donor or do an ancestry test and all the lies will be exposed. Glad I could get that off my chest. If you're assuming this is a good Christian family, you would be correct. It's all about appearance.
Story 20. That I was adopted by my auntie and her husband. My real father, her brother, was institutionalized after taking too much acid and losing his mind. He had acid and remained in hospital until he passed away. My real mother was Swedish and was a heroin addict and was unable to look after me. I was still in a pram at the age of 3 and unable to walk as I'd never been taught. I have 2 sisters by the mother who I've never met who probably don't know about me, and they were taken into care by social services. The real mother is believed to be dead now and was untraceable. I had a sad, hard, often cruel and unloving childhood. As the adoptive mother felt she had been lumbered with me. I found all this out at the age of 21 and had no idea at all about any of it. I'm now 53, happy and grateful. This is only a tiny part of my life that has been rocky to say the least. Oh well, that's life, I suppose.
Thank you for watching. If you like to watch more of these videos, please leave a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to share to your friends and family. I'll see you in the next video.